Welcome to today's episode of EV Hub Live. EV Hub Live is a live video podcast for public policy professionals working to advance transportation electrification. EV Hub Live is recorded live, so to tune in and ask questions or check the schedule, please visit atlasevhub.com/live. On today's episode, we'll be discussing what's next for the states as they implement their plans for the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program. We'll be hearing from Dr. Shawn Wilson, the Secretary of Louisiana's Department of Transportation and Development, and Kay Kelly, Chief of the Office of Innovative Mobility from Colorado's Department of Transportation, on what it will take to bring their NEVI plans to life. Here's your host, Atlas Public Policy's founder, Nick Nigro.
All right, welcome back to EV Hub Live. I'm your host, Nick Nigro, and I'm joined today by Secretary Wilson from Louisiana DOT. We are still trying to get Kay Kelly in from Colorado DOT. The IT gods are not shining on us at the moment, but we will push on. So very excited to have Secretary Wilson join us today. We're going to be talking all about NEVI, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program that was newly enacted as part of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Run out of the new Joint Office of Energy and Transportation here in Washington, where I sit. So let's bring Secretary Wilson into the show and get going. So these plans that were required for NEVI are all done. Everybody's approved. And so give us an idea what's next in Louisiana.
Wow. So thank you for having me, Nick, and good afternoon to you and your listeners and your viewers. Once that all of the states have submitted their plans, the first time I think we've had 100% participation in anything, and it was all done. And hats off to US DOT. And there's Kay. Hats off to US DOT for making that happen and turning them around. What's really exciting and neat is that every one of those plans are unique to the state where they exist. I know the transportation leaders have all considered ways to make this applicable and easy and efficient and user-friendly. And so all of the states, much like Louisiana, are transitioning into the implementation phase of what it is they've proposed to do in their plans. And for Louisiana, we're having our final discussions around putting together the grant program that's going to allow for public engagement and then for a rollout of applications, and then ideally an award at the end of Q1 or early Q2 of 2023. So states are about the business of now implementing and going forward, knowing what we know about the approved plans and the rules and guidance that has been promulgated by the US DOT.
Did I hear that right? Did you say that y'all are going to be trying to issue funds in Q1, Q2 of next year?
Yeah, absolutely. That's our hope. The reality is once those plans have been adopted, all of a sudden those funds become available. Mm-hmm. There's going to be some planning and some application development and then some commitments. Now, whether or not the dollars will actually hit the street is going to be contingent upon what is necessary. So whether there's some utility upgrades or whether there's some other infrastructure components, recognizing that we're going to have to deal with all kinds of elements in terms of the approval process, NEPA process. But we want to be able to say, here is what we're funding for XYZ. And so that entity that's applied, we want to have some certainty very early on, knowing that there's going to be the implementation phases of whatever those applications may be, because no two sites are going to be equal. But we know we have a plan. We know our commitment is for that every 50 miles. We know it's within a mile of each of the interstate. The idea is that we're going to have to adhere to the real sensitivities of where the location is, who's doing it, what's necessary for it. Ideally, we will find places that we can roll out very quickly to augment the system that we have today that's all privately owned and operated. But maybe that's going to go a lot quicker. But there's some rural areas, for example, that will need much more of an investment in infrastructure upgrades to be able to accommodate what's necessary.
Wow. I have to say I had some conversations with some NGO friends recently, and they were asking, when do we think dollars are going to go out the door? And we're like, is it going to happen in 23? And I'm like, I'm optimistic. I think it's going to happen sometime next year. I don't think I realized it'd be coming so soon. That's really good news.
Yeah. I think that's the best part of the trigger that US DOT set for submitting these plans and having these plans approved as the beginning. Now, that doesn't eliminate some of those other elements that are going to have to be considered. And if you approach it from a risk-based perspective, as I think most of our states will, we're not going to fund the most complex project first and expect to roll it out and have that look good. So I think we'll have an opportunity to find some tiers, some low-hanging fruit, if you will, to get the ball rolling, to demonstrate what this looks like, so we can get much quicker into our maintenance and operations of it. We can start to see the benefits, understand what's going to be happening with traffic, understand what's going to happen with the volume of cars that will come in and charge, and then learn from those issues and those opportunities so that we can iron out the wrinkles.
So, Kate, let's bring you into this conversation. Really glad you were able to get your IT folks to help you with the tech issues. It's a hallmark of a good DOT. You're fixing problems right away. So welcome to EV Hub Live, and let's get right to it. Tell us about what's coming up next in Colorado now that you all have your plan approved.
Yeah, thank you. And shout out to Greg Miller, who did some firewall gymnastics for us. So apologies for my tardiness. But yeah, much like my co-panelist, we're excited to get this funding moving as soon as possible. In Colorado, we're really fortunate to have a long history of collaboration between our state agencies in delivering programs like this, specifically EV charging grant programs. And we're just going to keep building on that with implementation of the NEVI program. Right now, we're collaborating with our Colorado Energy Office to integrate the new federal funding into our existing statewide grant programs for electric charging. We have a DC Fast Charging Plazas program. We have a Charge Ahead Colorado program. And we really feel like using these existing programs is going to help maintain consistency, maintain that streamlined application process that our site hosts are used to, but also have the ability to expand our funding to new grantees and new parts of the state with the influx of NEVI money as well. So in terms of roles, our energy office is going to continue to manage that front end process. They're going to be working with the applicants, compiling and scoring the proposals, awarding the grants, monitoring the implementation. And the Colorado Department of Transportation is going to be involved in all of those steps, supporting the Energy Office, of course, but also working behind the scenes to make sure that all the federal requirements are being met at that kind of programmatic level. So this approach has been really successful for us in the past, and we're hoping to continually improve it. And in terms of timing, we're aiming to release our first NEVI-funded request for applications in early 2023, and then adopt a regular release schedule moving forward. Right now, our grant programs usually have a spring and a fall timing when we have applications open. So we're thinking that we'll have a couple of openings of the NEVI funding a year.
Wow. Yeah, we picked two states who are really on the bleeding edge here, getting money out the door in the first half of the next year. That's really great news. I see from our live listeners.
What I was going to tell you is you got two states, one where you've done some serious investment in this already. So we can look to Colorado to learn about their investments and their grant program, because we've not had that here in Louisiana. So like some of the states in this country that are on the latter portion of development, it's going to be a new startup. So interesting dynamic and great selection, and two panelists, by the way.
Yeah, thanks for that. We always try to make sure that we have different levels of experience and engagement on issues when we try to bring these topics to our audience. Speaking of the audience, I see some questions coming in from our live folks, either on LinkedIn or YouTube, and so we might filter those into the conversation as things go on. I encourage people to keep queuing them up, and I'll work them in as I can. I'm going to stick with you, Kay, because while Colorado has a lot of experience, as you all have mentioned, and you're going to be leveraging a lot of existing work that you've done, there's some new things that come with NEVI. One of them is Justice 40. So in your plan, you talk about how you'll have state tools to help map and define equity. Can you talk a little bit about these tools and how they're going to work together?
Yeah, so we've been working to support the EV market here in Colorado for more than a decade. And over that time, we've been increasingly working to make sure that there's an equitable deployment of EVs and charging across the entire state, both from a geographic perspective and from a demographic sense as well. So prior to the IIJA passing and the incorporation of the Justice 40 requirements into the NEVI program, we had already been working to develop our own definitions, our own tools, our own equity approaches. So including Justice 40, we actually now have 4 approaches to equity that we're factoring into the process. So one of them is from our Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. They have a mapping tool called Colorado EnviroScreen, and that scores counties and census tracts and census block groups in relation to one another, and that's based on the environmental burdens that are placed on those populations in those particular areas. And then it has a disproportionately impacted community definition that's based on one of our pieces of state legislation. Then in 2021, we passed our big transportation funding bill, which was Senate Bill 21260. That created several new transportation electrification resources in the state. It also established a different definition of disproportionately impacted communities to be prioritized for these electrification investments. And it's slightly different, right? So, and then we also
different from Justice 40 or different from what y'all were doing before?
Different from both.
Okay.
So,
keeping you on your toes, yeah. Okay.
It keeps us on our toes for sure. And then the third approach that we had in the works prior to Justice 40 was our Colorado Energy Office recently completed a statewide EV equity study that identified different definitions and methodologies to, generally support more equitable outcomes in our EV programs. And there were some mapping tools, some prioritization tools in that as well. And this tool is maybe a little bit deeper than the Colorado EnviroScreen tool for some of the transportation metrics. And all of them are really valuable and provide a slightly different picture. So as you might expect, there's not a neat one-to-one overlap between the geographies that are identified in each of the 4 different approaches. So right now, we're working across state agencies. There's multiple agencies that are involved in all these different definitions, and really trying to incorporate factors from all 4 of the approaches into how we scope the grants, how we select the projects, how we implement, so that we're complying with all of these requirements and have that statewide consistency in our approach.
Let's stick with equity and turn it over to you, Secretary Wilson. In Louisiana's NEVI plan, you talk about some of the benefits that are going to come with this funding to disadvantaged communities. Can you walk us through them today and how you plan to measure those benefits?
Yeah, so, from a number of perspectives, ensuring that this EV rollout through NEVI is equitable, making sure that we look at everything from our rural communities to our urban communities, understanding the dynamics of Louisiana's population is really nodular in certain centers to concentrate there. When you look at the underserved communities, you think about workforce development, you think about economic opportunity in terms of placement. When you think about not necessarily investing all of your resources in one company or one entity to provide all of them in a corridor, you have an opportunity to diversify. Likewise, we know that some places are going to be more challenging than others, and ensuring that we have a marrying, if you will, of location such that a more challenging site gets paired with a not so challenging site so that you can have a commitment to not leave certain communities behind. All of those are ways I think that you can ensure equity in a program. You can also look at everything from subbing and maintenance opportunities in terms of what that long-term maintenance contract is going to look like for the owners and operators of these services, and how we can influence who they're working with and how that is a equitable or more diverse background of people. And then in terms of how you measure the success of all of these different factors, maintaining some level of accountability from an engineering and performance measure standpoint, I think is going to be absolutely essential. We think this is important because as we roll this out, there's going to be additional rollouts in terms of a secondary market, both of charging as well as vehicles. And we know the price point may not reach some of the socioeconomic communities today, but at some point that secondary market will, and we want to ensure that we can expedite that such that others will find some ladders of opportunity to take advantage of this technology from a resilience and a climate perspective to roll this out and be able to see some value in what we're offering with our state NEVI program. I think it's going to be a great opportunity to ensure that there's some opportunities to get folks in a new business space. When I compare what we're doing here to what we're doing in other parts of our business at DOTD, from a construction and concrete concrete. Those things, those companies aren't very diversified, perhaps. They aren't very many of them in certain areas. But with this process, I think this is only the beginning. Because remember, the $75 million we're going to spend is only the beginning. So if we can have a diverse population to deal with that, when the private sector begins to make these investments as well to grow this market into other footprints and not just our alternative fuel corridor, I think you're going to see those opportunities to grow for all of the businesses in the state of Louisiana. And that's going to be good for our economy. It's going to be good for our workforce. It's going to be good for our future in terms of making sure the people who are providing services here are representative of the people who are using the service as well.
I think one of the things you said really resonated with me, and that's around this becoming a core part of what transportation agencies are doing. In the last several years, we've seen DOTs around the country expand their horizons, doing more than just concrete and bridges, right? And doing a lot more into mobility services. And so, it's very positive news to hear you say that. You also mentioned something about reliability, and that gets us to one of the questions from our audience, which is quite a queue of questions at this moment. But let's talk about reliability of the chargers and stick with you, Secretary Wilson. The NEVI guidance includes 97% uptime for charging. Exactly what we mean by uptime is still being figured out for sure. But what does it mean for you? And how do you anticipate some of the most
great question
parts of that?
But I'm going to digress for 1 second. I also think this is going back to the previous segment that we just talked about. I think the model that we're using to deliver this service, I think is going to offer some benefits for the larger transportation network in terms of what we provide in DOTs in this grant model, in this public-private partnership model. Now, let me fast forward to where you are in terms of uptime. Clearly, the ability to provide the level of service or increased capacity at locations where we know we have high demand for charging, it's going to be critical. Those are going to be the more expensive components, I think, or the more expensive sites that we'll have to develop because of the need to build capacity in our grid. I think they are prime location opportunities for the discretionary pot once we roll out some of the formula-based work that's going to happen so that we can leverage the dollars much more effectively than we can if we chose to go with the most expensive areas to provide the capacity that's necessary. For several of our charging facilities now, I can tell you there's a constant wait for vehicle space or for charging opportunities because they've limited or they've maxed out, and we can look to duplicate some of that. So for me, it's building a grid that can provide that level of subsistence or charging capacity that will allow us to be able to serve the masses such that we can more efficiently serve the population.
Let's go over to UK and stick with uptime reliability. In your plan, in the Colorado plan, you talk about a real-time operational feed for charging operations. What does that mean from a consumer's perspective?
Yeah, so I think we all recognize that the availability of charging is one of the key elements that's going to give folks confidence that they can go electric in their next vehicle purchase. So in the past, the state's role in that might have ended with just, hey, we put in the charging station, we're good to go. But, we really feel like that operation and maintenance availability of the chargers is a super important part of what we're doing. We can't just assume that it's always going to work. And we want to make sure that we're maintaining that uptime so that drivers aren't unpleasantly surprised when they pull into a charge and they find a station that's not working, particularly if that's a station that's in, one of the more far-flung locations and it's one that they may have been counting on to make it to their destination. So we need to make sure that we have accurate and current information about the availability and the functionality of the chargers that are out there, and that's reaching the public through, some of these apps and mapping tools that people are using to locate their charging stations. And also, so the charging networks and the site hosts are aware when their stations are down so that they can get them repaired quickly and back online. So, EV drivers, especially new ones, tend to plan their routes really carefully. They plan them in advance. So having that reliable current information is going to prevent those negative experiences and potentially the negative news stories, right, that can discourage other people who may be on the fence about adopting from actually going through with that purchase. And I think I'll also say that this operation and maintenance component isn't unique to charging infrastructure projects. I think a lot of public officials will lament the money that is spent on big capital purchases or big construction projects and the lack of attention after it's built to that ongoing operation and maintenance work for that asset. So trying to think about it more as a long-term asset as opposed to it's installed and then our relationship with that charger is finished.
And so, Kay, if I may, I think you hit a really good point, because my comment about changing the model of delivery to much more of a public-private partnership where there's ongoing accountability, unlike what we would call our deferred maintenance list. I can't afford in the NEVI program to just let something sit there and wait on budget for us to be able to go do the maintenance improvement or to make those types of necessary upgrades that are necessary. And so without an imperative of a business model, states could very easily fall into the trap that we have in terms of pavement preservation. We'll just add that pothole to the list. We'll just add that bridge and go do some patchwork. You can't afford to do that when there's such a reliability level of importance to what we're providing. And I think if you tie this to other businesses in the private sector, the different real estate opportunities, the different convenience store opportunities, some of the standalone charging businesses that will develop, it's going to be tied into a successful maintenance operation because they're going to need to operate at the highest level of performance and not necessarily the average level of performance. And so this model that we have and the agreements that we intend to write ideally will support that.
I got to do one quick follow-up with you, Secretary Wilson, before I got another question for Kay. You talked about meeting expectations around performance and such. In your plan, Louisiana goes into comparing, investments in new sites versus upgrades. You also mentioned earlier that, y'all are relatively new to making these investments. How are you going to make that decision about upgrades versus new sites with considering what you were just saying about the importance of making sure the equipment is working and gets people to where they want to go?
Yeah, so two things. One, we've partnered with Louisiana Clean Fuels, who has a really good background and history in alternative fuels and have a really good handle of what's happening here, where we know where we have gaps beyond this standard that we've built or the ability to be able to manage those performances. And so we're going to have to make the intentional decision to say, I know where I'm going to be at this one location. It's going to need to go from 4 to 8 or 10 to 12. Those are things that we will need to prioritize and make the tough decisions with the resources that we have to allocate that, because we know that's going to come. My fear is that we fund one set of charging stations and it's way over capacity and not have resources set aside for the purposes of just capacity. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to be just a new one. We have some that we know where the private sector is already investing, and we might need to augment that to be able to offer that initiative. Then you've got the rural areas where there's probably not going to be any whatsoever desire from a private sector, but that's where marrying them will be. And just like in the issue of initial investment, we're going to prioritize such that we can set aside some new money for existing ones. We could do the same thing with, is it a C-store? Is it another general real estate issue? Or is it something that's going to be a capacity category? Those are things that we're engaging the public on in our outreach for our applications to understand what level should that be. I don't have the answer today, but I know that there's going to be a need such that adding capacity shouldn't compete with new capacity, no different than preservation competes with capacity today. So we will have to make those tough decisions and prioritize that.
Let's get back to you, Kay. There was an interesting question from the audience that kind of builds off some of the things you were saying earlier about your existing programs and such, and equity. In this case, the question is related to equity from the private sector side of things. And so can you talk to us a little bit about how you're going to go about implementing the NEVI funding to see if the money's going to either go to one or two companies versus a larger set?
Yeah, so our projects are all going out for, our request for applications. So it's an open, competitive process. And I think that there's room in that process for any interested firm to bid on that work, to propose locations, and to see where they rise in the scoring criteria. So yeah, I think there's a lot of room in this space.
Let's move on to what's coming next for you all. So the plans are there. Looking ahead, you're going to need to spend more support and to build out this public charging network. To both of you, what do you see as your next priorities after filling in these alt fuel corridors that are in the plan per the NEVI requirements? Why don't we start with Secretary Wilson?
So, we've expanded our alternative fuel corridors for the purposes of this program and others, but we know that there's still a lot more that we could do. And so in addition to looking at this particular level 1 build out of these principal stations and charging opportunities is going to be going to the next level and making sure that we do that kind of in tandem with our private sector partners, because I suspect there'll be others who are going to jump in this space purely on their own in terms of being a speculative business arrangement, and that will work. And so we have to then be flexible from the state's perspective to make sure that we're dealing with that appropriately. Also, with some of the critical statewide locations that we know are destinations that we're going to have to build capacity on that are outside of the procurement rules or the guidelines of NEVI is going to be important. And then the third lane, I think, will be thinking about competing for the larger pot to do some of that augmentation, because we have yet, as the state of Louisiana, provided a way to fully fund a program such as this. And so we could see that as an opportunity to leverage federal dollars and state dollars with an expanded grant program that might be somewhat outside of the four walls of the NEVI program as we know it today.
Kay?
Yeah, so in Colorado, we have a lot of existing programs that we're continuing to work on in addition to the NEVI funding. We recently had our transportation legislation create 3 new transportation electrification focused enterprises. And those are going to be providing grants for more EV charging, for electric bikes, for commercial vehicles, for transit fleet electrification. So there's really a lot going on here. And I think we're really fortunate in that we're going to be able to address a really broad spectrum of the state's vehicle charging and electric mobility needs simultaneously, rather than saying, well, we're just going to do alt fuel corridors now and then we'll do this other stuff later. There are certainly some challenges with having a small but mighty team who's tasked with doing a lot of different work, but it's an exciting challenge to have. I guess specifically with regard to NEVI, we really feel like our key focus areas are around ensuring that broad and equitable access to the benefits of electric mobility, making sure that that those benefits can accrue to everyone in Colorado, no matter where you live, no matter your income. And some of the key things we think are important there are really the charging for people who live in multifamily housing, including renters, since they frequently don't have access to their own garage or a reserved parking spot. And this, we know, makes EV adoption especially challenging for them. So some of our state grant programs are going to be able to help address these barriers through things like at home or neighborhood charging projects. We think school bus electrification is also really critical, both from a health and an environmental standpoint. One of the overlooked aspects of that is that, school buses don't just travel within, the district that they're assigned. Sometimes those buses need to travel across the state for different things that students are doing. So thinking beyond just, what are the depot charging needs for those vehicles, but how can we make sure that those buses are able to charge at other destinations as well? Transit is a big focus.
On this transit on buses, is some of the funding y'all are going to be making available, Kay, going to be for medium heavy duty when it comes to NEVI? Because it's a little bit unclear how many states are actually going to try to do that and whether they're going to focus mostly on just passenger vehicles. So are you all going to try to use some of the NEVI funds for that, or is that you're expecting that to come from another pot?
Yeah, no, for sure. I think our initial rounds are going to be focused on the passenger vehicle market, but we certainly have plans that we're going to be diving more into that medium and heavy duty market with NEVI. We also have state funding specifically to address fleet vehicle turnover transit vehicles, and medium and heavy duty charging as well. So, kind of pairing those NEVI funds with the state funds. And I think that the transit piece is interesting. Colorado actually provides the most rural transit trips in the nation. And as our transit fleet is transitioning to zero emissions, we're really going to be at the tip of the spear in figuring out charging, maybe even hydrogen refueling for some of these routes that are oftentimes quite lengthy, traversing mountainous terrain and often inclement weather, often at highway speeds. So a lot of things that are atypical of what most people probably think of when they imagine transit. Thinking about just kind of a typical city bus, and our transit looks a lot different than that.
Mm-hmm.
But some of those characteristics are also things that you see kind of in the medium, the probably more of the heavier duty side of the medium and heavy duty space as well. So lots of exciting things that we hope to be accomplishing on the medium and heavy duty front. And really one of our big focuses all along in Colorado has been the fact that, our residents and our visitors really value access to outdoor activities like skiing and hiking and biking and camping. And we have some current programs as well that are installing EV charging at all 43 of our state parks, along all 26 of our scenic and historic byways. And that's really intentional because we want to convince both our locals and our tourists that they can experience the natural beauty in our state in an electric vehicle. And that, of course, is protecting our environment, clean air, blue skies, and all the things that people love about Colorado.
Mm-hmm. I spent a summer there in grad school, and I can echo that for sure. Secretary Wilson, what about you all in medium heavy duty vehicles?
Yeah, we're primarily focused on passenger vehicles in this first rollout because I think in a state that has seen some real investment from an industrial side, whether it's real alternative fuels, CNG, LNG, EV, and even some hydrogen, the idea that those fleets are going to be much more capable of providing that at their locations. We've not considered dedicating a big chunk, if any, of this first round of funds. I think it's a great opportunity from a discretionary standpoint to be able to leverage other programs that might come from natural resources or DEQ here in Louisiana. Those are things that we just don't have the capacity financially to do right now and still deliver the full build out of the alternative fuel corridor that we've identified for the masses. We see that happening right now, whether it's Amazon or some of the other fleets that we have operating in the state. They're making those investments. Now, schools, on the other hand, are going to be huge from a bus standpoint for buses that are moving either public transit and or students. That may be an opportunity for us in one of the later phases to begin to do some implementation. We did a little of that with VW settlement. I don't know that you're going to see a large part of that out of NEVI in these initial years.
All right, so we're going to close out with the question about an entity we haven't mentioned too many times yet, and that's what we discussed earlier, this idea of what's next and other ways of forming partnerships. There is one giant potential infrastructure partner here, and that's the electric utility. So I wonder if we start with Kay and then go to Secretary Wilson, talk a little bit about how you see the utility as a partner and ally in NEVI and then some of the other programs you've mentioned. We start with Kay. Go ahead.
Yeah, the utility absolutely has to be a partner and in the conversation here. We have many utilities in Colorado, some of the big ones like Xcel and some very small rural cooperatives. And our energy office has been working really closely with all of them. Our big utilities are required to file transportation electrification plans with the Public Utilities Commission, and some of them are going into their second round on some of those programs. They've been great at doing things like fleet services and EV rate designs. And I think that over time, that's going to continue to filter from the larger utilities into the smaller utilities. But I'll say even with the smaller utilities, we've seen some great collaborations with some of our early adopter fleets that aren't in the big service utility territories to get some projects done and do it in really creative ways.
So for Louisiana, the utilities are governed by the Public Service Commission. We've not had extensive relations with them in this space prior to this as a state just getting into it. But I will tell you, Louisiana Clean Fuels has had a tremendous history with them, and we will absolutely engage. We see it as an equity issue, particularly in areas that might have multiple providers. And so creating the necessity and creating the relationship with them, I think is fundamental for us. And it's one that we will continue to work with. We see those eligible costs for improvements to be important, not just for the NEVI program, but for other types of redundancy within the system. Unfortunately, we've had several challenges from a natural disaster standpoint where they've hardened and built their systems. We think some of that's going to leverage what we're doing. And a lot of that was factored into the overall plan that we have for our state rollout, understanding that in some places we're already there with very minimal improvements. In other places, we're going to have a long reach to get. But utilities have to be a part of that discussion. I think it's going to evolve even more as we go through a debate here in terms of what level of service they might be able to provide in terms of owning utility stations or electric vehicle services stations. That's going to be an interesting debate that we're going to have in Louisiana, I suspect, in this next legislative session.
Very exciting news here. Really appreciate both Secretary Wilson and Kay joining us. Two great states, Louisiana and Colorado. Really interested to see what comes next. I can't believe y'all are going to be spending money so early next year. Stay tuned for anybody who's interested in applying for those funds. But that brings us to a close here for this episode of EV Hub Live. Greatly appreciate my guests and the audience. Love the questions from everyone. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but hopefully catch you next time. I'm your host, Nick Nigro, and this is EV Hub Live. Thanks so much. Bye, everybody.